for coming today, and welcome to the latest talk in the Publics at IIHS series, which, as you know, is a series of public talks and seminars and discussions. My name is Gautam Bhan. I'm faculty here at IIHS, and I am very, very happy to introduce a friend, a colleague, someone whose work that I have followed for a very long time, Sonal Sharma, who will be speaking to us today. Let me give you a more formal biography. Sonal is a PhD student at the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is also the Regional Coordinator South Asia of the Research Network for Domestic Workers' Rights. He has a master's degree in Development Studies from Ambedkar University in Delhi and a bachelor's degree in Economics from the University of Delhi. Before starting his PhD at Johns Hopkins, he worked as a research associate at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. With his research interests at the intersection of labor politics, caste and gender, Sonal has published on women workers in the informal sector in journals such as Samaj and EPW, and he has written on the issue of domestic workers' rights both in English and in Hindi in dailies such as The Hindu and Jansatta. And we have left a copy of his recent paper acknowledging home as a workspace, that is the op-ed in The Hindu. So if you're stepping out and would like to grab a copy, it's available online, but there's a set here free for taking. So I just request you to take a second, put your phones on silent so that they don't go off in the middle of the talk. And to also say that the way we'll structure the session is that I've asked Sonal to take about 45 minutes, after which we will open it up for discussions and questions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sonal Sharma.
For that introduction, Gautam. Am I audible? Yeah, it's working. What I'm going to present today is a project in the making. So before I start, like the usual disclaimer, like what it is going to be about. For this, I've been interested in understanding domestic worker struggle in India historically, and it started with in Delhi when I was working. Once in a while, I used to come to know about domestic workers in a locality have just gone on strike without any sort of mobilization, and that made me curious, how do we look at resistance of groups like domestic workers historically, where do some of these acts of resistance, organizing, politically and getting mobilized, where do these efforts get registered? And through that I started looking at journals and material, and in that process I found out about how in India domestic workers, as many of us might think that they have started organizing recently and started demanding rights. I found out that domestic workers started organizing much before, as early as 1930s. The image you see on your right is dharna by domestic workers in Bombay in 1972. This Gharelu Kamgar Sangh, which was affiliated to Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which again is like a trade union of Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. They organized a day-long strike in 1972 in which 25,000 workers, out of which 20,000 workers were men and 5,000 women domestic workers who went on strike, and there was this dharna which almost brought the entire city to a halt. Now this image is from a recent dharna in Delhi, in which about 5,000 domestic workers in Delhi protested from across the country, from Tamil Nadu, Andhra, shouting slogans in different languages, staged a demonstration against two key issues. One was the demand for legislation for regulating domestic work. The second was the new labor code which are being introduced by this government. What was interesting about this comparison to the previous image and the dharna which took place in 1972 is that I think for the first time all central trade unions along with organizations working on domestic workers came together for this protest, unlike in 1972 which was just organized by one union. What is common in these two protests, which are several decades apart from each other, is this demand for a legislation. And I think it's this consistent demand for having a comprehensive legislation to regulate domestic work, which got me interested in understanding what has happened to this demand. And it's by looking at some of the parliamentary debate that I'm going to talk about today. So the dominant scholarship on domestic work has two broad themes. So first is because domestic workers have not been organized as workers in the public sphere, we need to pay closer and more attention to, which is not seen as the site of work, which is employer's home, and how, through everyday practices, subtle practices, workers try to resist unequal relations. And a lot of scholars have written on this, and one of the most pioneering work is by Rakari and Simin Kayam, Culture of Servitude, which, absolutely, if you get a chance to look at it, check it out. The other theme, which is there in the scholarship, is like how domestic workers, as a case of informal workers in India, have historically been excluded from both labor laws and the sphere of labor politics. Now, looking at these two broad themes and some of my preliminary findings, which is suggested that there was an effort to have a legislation for domestic work as early as 1950s in India, I wanted to look at like what has been the state's role like in resisting, coming up with the legislation. And what today I'm going to talk about is look at some of those preliminary findings. Now, as I said that in 1959, like the first bill was presented, and I'll discuss it in more detail. The fact that there were unions, and when one goes through like Census of India records, like as early as like the first census recording domestic workers, when you go through like Indian Labour Yearbook, you see that at least one union filing returns every year. And I think for me it was fascinating in the beginning. And as I was going through that, I was interested in understanding that if we do not have domestic workers like as workers, because for a very long time the state did not collect data, like until like 2000. And what I mean by that is like in census, because almost everything gets recorded, that will not be considered workers are being considered workers. But you have to collect data on wages and a lot of other aspects related to work. So I was interested in understanding how the state classified domestic workers as a group. So when we go through all these public records and parliamentary debates, and like how does the figure of domestic worker emerge? Like what are the most themes, and what do these classification practices reflect? I'll come to like what I mean by classification, and like how classification is a helpful lens to look at both worker struggle as well as state's role in coming up with the legislation, and if these classifications change over a time. Now, I look at domestic workers, this demand for having a legislation as a struggle for seeking a desired legislation to appear as workers. Now, I arrive at this concept and use it as a lens after Pierre Bourdieu's usage of the concept, who discusses it in detail. And in a critique of Marx, he talks about how you have to look at like various aspects of like social life, and often there are authorities and bodies in society which are constantly classifying social experiences. So for example, academics are constantly classifying, labeling, naming what happens in society. Policymakers do it. If we look at trade union activists also, because when you go and reach out to workers, what you're doing is you are naming an experience that you are a worker. Workers are many other things, and there are many other things like everyday life is really messy. So Bourdieu, looking at all these aspects, foregrounds the role of state, and what he says is that state has the power to officially nominate, and by officially nominating it renders certain aspects of social life, certain groups and collective experiences visible in a certain way. So this is from Bourdieu's discussion on like the importance of classification. The capacity to make entities exist in the explicit state, to publish, make public, that is, render objectified, visible, and even official what had not previously attained objective and collective existence, and had therefore remained in the state of individual or serial existence. People's malaise, anxiety, disquiet, expectations represents a formidable social power, the power to make groups by making the common sense. And I'll come to is that what is it that by nominating, by classifying, how do certain aspects of social life become common sense? The explicit consensus of the whole group. In fact, this work of categorization, that is of making explicit and of classification, is performed incessantly at every moment of ordinary existence. Now, there is a lot going on in these sections, but what I want to draw attention to is that how through the act of classification, while state is rendering something visible, something recognizable in social life, it is also an act of power that only certain bodies like state have the power to do. I am mostly drawing on in archival sources parliamentary debates and questions. So since 50s, I go through all the debates possibly, through online archive, and like go through all the discussions related to private members' bills which were presented. So all the bills which have been presented to regulate domestic work in India have been private members' bill. And the Liber archives to see how this issue has been discussed in the trade union movement, newspapers, how do they report strike somewhere, and I think that has been very useful. Government documents, so when a legislation is there, what kind of files are moving around and what's happening, and then oral histories. So today I will mostly focus on parliamentary debates and some government documents. I will leave oral histories aside for today just to keep discussion focused. A history of organizing of domestic workers actually started as early as 1930s. So in Nilgiri's, I think the first instance I find is Nilgiri's Domestic Servants Union, which was founded by Ernest Kirk, who I found out was a disciple of Sri Narayana Guru. So those of you who know, he was in Kerala, big figure in anti-caste movement. So that union, I think there's some information of what, they were definitely, one of the things they were demanding is that, working conditions for the workers should be better. And a lot of organizing is about inclusion of workers in policy just like other workers. Then in the 40s, I find Bombay Samaj Samata Sangh, having a meeting for domestic workers who work for European employers. Now, once again, Samaj Samata Sangh, if it is, and again, when you're going through archives, it's, one has to try to make sense of very little information sometimes. Samaj Samata Sangh was, there was a Samaj Samata Sangh which was founded by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So I am also trying to look for what was the ideology of this group and how were they fighting for domestic workers, right? In the 1950s, in Delhi, domestic servants, All India Domestic Servants Union was founded, which opened, which also started working in Calcutta, Bombay, and other parts of the country. And I can go on and on, but I have just listed some of the, prominent example in history of organizing of domestic workers and their role. I will pay, special attention to All India Domestic Servants Union and their role in, having a national legislation. Since independence, since the first bill was presented in 1959, there have been almost 12 bills. The most recent one was presented in 2017, and I won't have time to go through the content of these bills, and that's something I'm still working on, but there is a remarkable shift in terms of what is the content of domestic workers' rights. So National Domestic Servants Union, which was founded in Delhi in 1955, and their first meeting happened in July 1947, almost a month before the independence. And they struggled for having a legislation at both state and national level. They started with having a legislation at the state level, and as a part of that, they had this domestic servant bill, which was accepted by Delhi Assembly and finally circulated for public opinion. It didn't go anywhere, but I think when it was circulated for public opinion, I'll briefly discuss what happened to that. In 1959, after things didn't work out at the state level, the union went on a 26-day long strike, and they wanted to have a national legislation. 4th December 1959, the bill was presented. There were two bills presented, one in Lok Sabha, one in Rajya Sabha. The Rajya Sabha one was presented by this member P. N. Raj Bhoj, who, again, very briefly, who was a member of Scheduled Caste Federation, again, founded by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and I think it's important to keep in mind who these people are, and Kanhaiyalal Balmiki, who was, a part of various sanitation workers union. So these two bills were presented in 1959. There was a discussion. They, again, usually private members will, as we know, they don't really succeed. But I think what is important is that they are presented to make a statement that certain groups and their interests matter. Response to the 1959 bill, there is about like 60-page long debate on this bill, and like all sorts of interesting things being said, and which gives insights into like what was happening at like basically the social imaginary at that point. One of the issues and the responses to the bill is like this discussion about like if it's a family or an employment relationship, which is still, I think, ongoing, how we talk about this work. But one of the issues is that, how treating servants, I will use the word servants because that's how, I mean, it is used even today and historically it's been used, is that, servants are like children, like how they also treat their employers like their parents, and it's a familial relationship. So talking about this relation in terms of as a labor relation, as an employment relationship does not make sense. So that's like one of the responses, and response to say that, we don't need to have this bill or like as an act. The most fascinating for me was the state of the economy, like how the conditions are unripe. So constantly those who oppose the bill during this discussion say that India as a poor country cannot afford to have a legislation like this because it will lead to massive employment and prevalence of domestic service usually is a reflection of widespread poverty. So so that's something which goes on till the 90s. That how it says something about the society as a whole, that for instance, like in the 90s, even after 40, 50 years of independence, like the fact that this sector exists says something about, how, we have failed in achieving freedom for all. So it's very rhetorical, but I think they're insightful in terms of how to understand what people have to say. The definition and some other issues, this bill, it was, I mean, the first bill, but there were several problems. For example, in addition to not specifying a lot of important aspects of domestic service and like completely ignoring part-time workers, and that's why some members said that we don't think this bill should come into existence. Like 2/3 of the bill actually talks about police verification, and only 1/3 is about like leave for domestic workers, better wages, notice before firing them. So it's also not looking at the first bill itself as completely emancipating workers, but just there were several issues which I'll come to later. The one important issue which I will focus on in detail in this presentation is that treating domestic workers as potential criminals. As I just said that the fact that this first bill, which was very important, 2/3 of the bill is just about like how to get police verification done, and if the employers don't get this police verification done, they can be in trouble. So it's there are these two things, these two forms of classification parallelly going on. So on your right, what you see is a letter by employers mostly who responded to the Delhi Domestic Servant Bill in 1956 when it was circulated for public opinion. On your left, you see a postcard. So a member of like All India Domestic Servants Union basically sent their postcards that why this bill should come into existence, supporting the bill, and on the other side you see. What was interesting, I mean, I think again, like on the right side, you see that it's the same thing that employers talking about, like how it's like a familial relationship. Domestic worker also think of us as like their family. So this bill should not come into existence. This other side says that the conditions are really bad and we really support this bill. What I will not have time to discuss in detail is that employers, we think of domestic labor, employment of domestic worker as a household relationship, but when they are opposing this bill in Delhi, and right now I'm talking about the state level legislation, they are not opposing it as like households, but as a a very powerful section of petty bourgeois class, by which I mean that you see letters coming on letterhead of like Kapda Merchant Association. You have Grain Merchant Association, you have Dyers Associations, so like you see all the stamps, like how they're signing is that, as a very organized class. So it does not appear as, something which is very scattered and like households will be vulnerable, but people who are very organized in the public domain are responding to it as, as a class. In addition to these bills, these 12 bills, which have been presented, there are also these questions and responses in Parliament which are worth examining, and how they reflect the kind of classification practices at work by the state. So there are two broad themes which emerge when I went through these parliamentary questions and responses. One which mostly looks at domestic work issue, domestic workers as workers. The second is which looks at domestic workers as potential criminals. Now, there can also be more themes, and there is a reason why I think there are two themes and these are two competing themes. Is that often there are only two ministers to which these questions are addressed to. So often when domestic workers are thought of as potential criminals, it is Minister of Home Affairs who has to respond to it. So the question is directed at Minister of Home Affairs. When questions are discussed as domestic workers as workers, related to working conditions, housing, is there data on their conditions, what's happening, trafficking, it's minister, labor minister usually. So, I will say that these are there is a larger struggle due to which these two themes emerge as I progress in this presentation. What is interesting in when Labour Minister responds to the question of, say, when Member of Parliament asks, is there data on domestic workers? Do you have data on wages? The answer is usually no. It's we do not have any data. It is not possible to collect. We can't collect it. We have decided not to have a legislation. So usually it's no in response to most of the questions. But when it comes to questions related to what is the crimes by domestic workers are rising, have you taken a notice of it? Do you have any statistics of what's happening? Minister of Home Affairs immediately provides data of what is the crime scenario, crimes by domestic workers. And to me that was interesting, that how you're talking about the same group of workers, but how come you have statistics on one aspect of relationship but not on another? So I think, and it's just goes on. Now, classification of domestic workers as potential criminals, there are different sources and in public documents you can find National Crime Records Bureau, for example, and again there is a reason why it appears as a category. Other workers you will not see in this manner, but Delhi Administrative Report, for instance, will have two tables. One will be crime by pickpockets, theft by pickpockets, theft by domestic servants. Similarly, if you go look at some of these police administrative reports in colonial India, colonial Delhi specifically, you see that many of these reports also mention this category of crime by domestic servants. So there will be bicycle thief, theft by domestic servants, and then miscellaneous. So it's interesting, how does this category come into existence? I need to do more work on, and then maybe it will be more convincing, is to say that IPC 381, actually applies to. So there is a category in which, if there is a theft by domestic worker, it goes into that. So how it appears in National Crime Records Bureau is through that IPC. Again, this is another instance, in the same house, when you ask a question, Minister of Home Affairs, what measures have you taken for police verification, etc. This kind of documents are provided. This form has details complexion, height, birthmark, and which renders domestic workers' body or servant's body visible in a particular way. So, as one goes through, this is an instance, I've combined two responses to show basically, how come, you're providing very neat data on one aspect of the employment relation and not another. What I want to, I have some more time, so I'll just spend some time on this aspect. the practice of police verification and like how state classifies workers and how that affects like everyday micro relations between employer and employee is an important one. During my fieldwork in Delhi and Bombay, while interacting with workers, it was I did not look at it as an important aspect. For example, when I was doing fieldwork, I never looked at like accusation of theft as an important part. But in response to one question, which was like what like in Hindi I used to ask workers कि आपको काम करते वक्त किन चीज़ों का ध्यान रखना पड़ता है. It was surprising. All workers, in response to these questions, only talked about like this fear of accusation of theft. And as I like started exploring more, I realized like how big this as an issue like work in constituting like the everyday work experience. For example, which I discuss in a paper called Valuables Out of Place and how domestic workers negotiate everyday inequality in middle class homes, is that while cleaning and doing household work, when workers find what they consider valuable, it could be anything from a chocolate to expensive jewelry, they feel that employers are doing this to test them. Okay. Now, workers kept talking about like an out of place could be anything, under the pillow, on table you keep your wallet. That's how workers perceive it. Now, some workers claim that they think that employers do this to test their loyalty. That if the worker will pick it, right? But sometimes when I ask workers, I'm like, but have you ever seen your employee doing this? A lot of them said no, they hadn't. And I'm like, then how do you know that they are doing it? What workers said is that like when I started working, some workers told me that when you start working, you will find things here and there, never touch them, that they keep it to test you. The point I'm trying to make is that there are also there is a way in which some of these practices shape workers' relationship not with their employers but also everyday material settings. So I think the issue is beyond like good employers, bad employers, good workers, bad workers. There is a way in which like practices by state affect something very mundane which looks completely unregulated. And not really in control. So so those are the implications of some of these practices. When I look at the struggle for classification, and I see that what I'm calling it like these are competing forms of classification, that workers are struggling for seeking recognition as workers, which hasn't happened, but workers already appear in state's record as potential criminal. So these are two competing forms of classification. Like one prevails, the other is like still struggling to come into existence. The reason why I titled this presentation "The Making of Workers," actually inspired by E.P. Thompson's book "The Making of English Working Class," is not to just highlight politics as something like like only talk about resistance, but actually talk about like also larger mechanism which shape worker subjectivity today. So the worker, the organizers, the trade union organizers are organizing today is not just they just don't like embody this desire to fight for their rights, but also they embody this vulnerability, this potentiality that they can be accused of theft. And I think it's like a whole process which we have to take into consideration if we really have to understand the everyday realities in which workers work. There are things I haven't discussed in this presentation, but I would like to summarize what I am trying to argue by looking at the struggle for classification, going through these parliamentary debates, and collecting these oral histories. Instead of looking at the history and politics of paid domestic labor in India, something which starts recently, I think we can have a long-term perspective on it. I will argue that now the top two elements, I will say that we can look at two phases in the history of organizing and politics of domestic workers. So the first one, I mean, those who write and many of many of you who grew up in 60s, 70s have seen that it used to be a male-dominated occupation and now it's feminized. Now, census and other data sources confirm that. And I think that's also linked with the increased insecurity of the work itself. It's not the same thing it used to be. The work arrangement, like earlier, a lot of workers used to be full-time live-in, now part-time live-out. I think there's something to be said about the nature of state. So in these two periods, I think how state looks at this category of workers. Do you look at it as a poverty issue? Do you want to skill them? And linked with that is, I'll come to forms of organization later, but state perspective. I think state is important because in the decades of 50s, 60s, 70s, the theme of poverty, of linking domestic work with poverty and how it should almost be, it should not exist in a society we are trying to build. So I'm calling it abolitionist, that eventually it will disappear. It also comes from this, this modernization perspective that, eventually there are things which will disappear in society and we will have mostly industrial sector as the key employing sector. To skill building. Now, this I haven't discussed today, but if you look at the state perspective today, this whole obsession with skilling workers, you cannot have a legislation, you don't want to give rights to workers, you want to skill them. Now, once you are given skills, you will become empowered. So I think that marks, nobody now talks about, that this work should not exist in society and the India we are building now, it will not be part. Nobody says that. So I think that's a shift in how this category of workers is discussed. And the reason I'm calling it neoliberal, the state, is that there's something about that, you can talk about welfare, skill building, but not rights. And domestic workers, it's not just domestic workers, it's labor in general, and domestic workers, as they are struggling for a comprehensive legislation, that becomes a major hurdle in that. Framing of relationship. Looking at these debates, it becomes clear that what previous phase of domestic worker struggle represents is a relationship in which it was mostly master-servant. A lot of people use it in a loose sense, but I will say that it's master-servant not only because in parliamentary debates and documents, its employers are referred as master and servant, but also how the practice of police verification was, it comes directly from master-servant relationship. Now it has changed a lot. In today, in parliamentary discussions and debates, I don't find questions which I find in the 60s and 70s. So there is a difference, and also how workers looked at their relationship. And today it's more about employer and domestic worker. Not to say that there is no emotional personal tie, or workers don't think of employer's family as their family. There are all sorts of possibilities, yes, but it's still it's not the same kind of dependence it used to be. The last point, which I think is important, is that back then, who is a domestic worker? The definition used to be really broad. So for example, while going through the postcards which worker had sent for the legislation, some domestic workers are motor drivers, Mali. Now, currently, a domestic worker, and mostly it's the choice the global movement has made, is that domestic workers are mostly those who work inside the household and not just for the household. So there is a shift in what how we see through these two phases. So as I go along and analyze more material which I've collected, I need to test if some of these if these two time periods really make sense. If instead of saying domestic workers have historically been invisible, unorganized, we need to look at these aspects. So just to sum up quickly, I will say that the history of domestic worker struggle and state, particularly when we look at the role of state, that that parliament is a site of competing classification. It's just like a site. It's telling us about something which has been going on, and domestic workers as worker is just one form of classification, right? So the other classification which has prevailed and in practice is, as I discussed, potential criminals. the making of domestic workers as workers, again, I will say that we need to look at the symbols workers draw on to claim this identity of a worker, because sometimes it seems obvious. For example, the slogan that domestic work is work and domestic workers are workers. Those who organize, you have to see that the kind of cultural work they have to put in to convince women workers that what you do is worthy. It is just like working in factory or office. So what I'm also trying to work on is to understand that cultural work, historically the process, like what are the symbols workers and workers organizations draw upon to claim this identity way before international organizations like ILO said that they are workers. What were those conditions in which when India was way poorer in many ways, these workers tried to claim that identity? What were the conditions? What enabled them? Was it like the labor movement at some point in general was strong? So we see in Bombay workers claiming this identity much earlier than other parts of the country. But most importantly, what I'm also arguing is that instead of looking at the issue of domestic work as a lack of recognition, as invisibility, we need to look at it as misrecognition. Domestic workers have not been invisible. Domestic workers have been recognized. It's just the state has misrecognized them. And as Bourdieu calls a form of an act of misrecognition is basically inflicting symbolic violence on a group. So just keeping some of these themes which are emerging based on my preliminary analysis, I am trying to also then say that what can we say about various category of workers in India in an organized sector historically with very low bargaining power? How have they organized? What is their relationship with their work? And I will say that it's not just complete invisibility, absence of struggle, and just one section of labor being privileged and doing very well at the cost of the other section. I think it's much more complex, but there's a lot of work to be done in that. Thank you very much. On that, I just.
Thank you very much for that. The floor is open. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and open up. And so it would be nice if you just briefly introduce yourself and leave.
I just wanted to share some of your experiences, what were the difficulties you faced while collecting the data while researching?
Right. Is it mostly with workers or generally this archival material? Yeah.
And the parliamentary debates.
Right.
Hi, I'm Rahul. I'm also a PhD student where I study very different things. I actually have 3 questions, but I'll ask 2 of them now. Maybe it just becomes too much. But you had kind of alluded to the importance, the significance of the caste connection right in the beginning, with between the unions and domestic worker fights. You didn't come back to that, so I was hoping you could speak a bit more to that to kind of underscore why that's significant, because to me at least, I would assume that that is sort of by default because domestic workers came from a particular set of castes, but I might be wrong, so if you can just tell me why that's an important sort of connection. That's one. 2, so I completely agree and appreciate this sort of the 2 sides of representation that you're talking about. One is as the worker and one is as the criminal. Where I'm a little sort of hoping to discuss more is whether the sources of data that you're using, the police records and sort of collection of data on crime versus the sort of survey, which is a certain form of collection of data. They have 2 different objectives. One, and to me, while one is an explicit effort at categorization, to me does not seem like the other is doing the same. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're collecting, say, labor data, there is sort of this, you have to kind of understand who this person is and categorize them as a worker. On the other hand, when you're collecting, when it's a police record, sort of by default, the perpetrator is identified, and therefore that might be a domestic worker. To me, it doesn't seem like a categorization issue. So, if you could speak a bit more to that. Yeah.
Sir, I am Natras, MSW in the insurance psychiatric social work. With your research background, whether the domestic workers have already become organized or anonymized, even today. Just I want to know the status only. Second one, I greatly objected that there are very potential criminals. Domestic workers are potential criminals. What you have brought out in that. Domestic workers are potential criminals that you are shown, Is it a prejudice or the stigma it is inherited from the long years and still it is continuing? Because most of the research workers, what they have carried out to work, they won't touch that thing, whether to rehabilitate, regenerate or anything. Simply they will carry that word. It is reformed a lot because in the earlier days it is inevitable to sustain the life, maybe they are doing some criminal things. But today it is well organized. So if you take an example, any IT people, if they want to employ some domestic worker, they will pay very good salary. And they will also select even that caste and gender criteria, what you have shown, they will select only from their caste and the gender, preferably gender will be female. That is why the criminal has come down diminishing. Because I belong to that department also. That is why just, that is my opinion what I am telling.
Hi, I was struck by the fact that the first union that you encountered was the Nilgiri Domestic Workers Union. And I'm wondering to what extent the fact that it was located in a plantation economy was kind of contributed to that fact, and how that might be an important point to actually theorize, right? The second kind of related point was, what are the ways in which the rural and the urban feature in the legislation, in the thinking, and in the way in which servitude itself is kind of conceptualized?
It's very difficult. I will say that, when you're looking at something as specific as this, like you're looking for, you are going through, say, police records in Bombay, like entire 20th, like the first 50 years of 20th century. It's very difficult to find something. So, for example, like a lot of parliamentary debate data which I've got, like it's about 73 documents, ranging from like a 60-page long debate to like 1 page, is mostly through the online archive. Now in that too, it's like very unequal. For some reason, Rajya Sabha online archive works way better than Lok Sabha one, and I don't know what's the problem. So I have to manually go and look through these records for Lok Sabha in one of the archives. So that's one issue, that when you're looking for something as specific as this, it's very difficult to find exact material. And like those of you who work with archives, it's like hit or miss thing that So like I'm looking at Delhi and Bombay, like I'm looking at national legislation, but then I'm also looking at like local struggles in Delhi and Bombay. In Delhi, it was very easy to find like a lot of material, but Bombay, just going through those archives, it was a huge struggle. So definitely those issues are there. I think the question of caste in domestic work, I think I'm still grappling with that. And I'll tell you what I mean by that, is that on the one hand, I'm talking about all these figures which have been associated with anti-caste struggles and then presenting this legislation. At the same time, you see that domestic work or employment of domestic workers turns into a site of anti-caste stance of various groups. For example, I'll give you 2 instances. First is All India Women's Conference in 1941 in Bangalore, which happened. They had like several recommendations, and it's an important, like 40s is very important, from the point of view of like nation building. one of the things they suggest to their members is that you hire at least one Harijan servant. Okay, what it means is that a lot of us think that like domestic service is all about like mostly Dalits or like Bahujan castes have done. I think it's been slightly complex. Similarly, Harijan Sevak Samaj Sangh, which was founded by Madan Mohan Malviya, in the constitution, they also asked their members to like have somebody from Harijan family as their member, or like employ them as domestic workers. So it's like it's not clear that does it represent like a form of like caste oppression, like employment of domestic workers, like mostly the workers who have performed came from like certain like so-called lower caste, or as the two instances I cited. So I'm not clear, honestly, and I think it's still emerging, and I need to spend more time with this data and see what it has to say. Excellent question that and I think like as I am like grappling with this the question of classification, I will still say that it's an act of categorization, something which not the period I'm looking at is mostly post-independence. It's not the post-colonial state which is categorizing them, but I'm saying like these categories are coming from somewhere, and where it is coming from, as I said, like it's IPC 381. What I like, the reason I could not produce data on that because the records I'm going through from IPC 379 to 381, they just merge it. Now there are all sorts of things, so I can't really look at which one is my domestic workers. So yes, like it's easier to collect that data when an act has happened versus a survey, carrying out a survey. But that's the whole thing about police verification. It is never implemented. Like in India, like not that all employers go and get their workers verified, and police also. But I'm saying like, but there is like a lot of detail in that form itself. Like from like bodily details to like all aspects of like how they will go back and the worker's place of origin. So what I'm saying is there is definitely something very, very unequal at work. There is a way in which like the state recognizes one aspect of it but not another. Like I'll just cite one more example to show, and I'm just trying to put this all into a framework. The National Crime Record Bureau produces like crimes by domestic servants. So if you look at like some of these Times of India articles, like they cite like Calcutta mein itna hua, Bombay mein itna hua. They also produce statistics on crime against maid servants. Now the difference is that you are rendering the criminal almost invisible when you are talking about the crimes against maid servants, but you are actually classifying a group of workers as criminals in like crime by domestic servants. So what they apply, like mostly it's anti-trafficking like act, and so those are the categories in which it is captured. I think it's just like the struggle between that yes, there are atrocities committed against workers, there are workers who steal stuff, like there are all sorts of, it's possible. It's just how do certain classification, categorization over time become facts, while others you just can't trace them. Like where does that go? And I think that's the only like power inequality I am like trying to understand, talk about. Your question about the status of organizing today, it's there are the number of unions objectively has risen a lot. Like you see both NGOs and unions working, and since the ILO convention, which India has not ratified, there is a pressure on like member countries to either have like a comprehensive legislation for domestic workers or apply other labor legislation to them. So with that, the prospects for many unions have changed. So many central trade unions which did not organize domestic workers as workers are organizing them. So things are changing, and as I discussed that that was perhaps the first time like all central trade union, BMS to Hind Mazdoor Sabha, like name it, along with all the organizations like Seva, which have conventionally worked, like or NGOs, came together for this protest. So things are changing. The rural-urban I think that's a very good question. There is a, I'll just like cite one example in which like it was clearly discussed. So at the time of independence, like National Planning Committee, which had various subcommittees, to basically make a roadmap for, independent India. And there was a subcommittee on irrigation, urbanization, etc., etc. The subcommittee on labor actually discussed the issue of domestic workers, that there should be a legislation, the issue of working hours. Now that's an important, I think an important point. But they actually excluded, they said but we cannot, if we have a legislation, if something, if there's a legal provision, it's very difficult to implement for rural workers. So they only talked about urban workers. So there are these disparities we see, and it's most of domestic workers in today's India is 2/3 is urban. So there is a completely urban shift which has happened. Yeah.
Any attempt has been made to plug in on the regional video side? I will come back.
Hi. So when we look at this particular category of informal workers, that is this domestic workers, starting from the space where this work is being happened, the work is actually happening, the space where the whole attempt towards organizing this category of workers is happening, and the nature of the state itself, something which is very important is the spatiality. So are there any attempt towards spatiality, towards organizing or spatiality towards the nature of the state or the nature of NGOs which you are mentioning here, and so on?
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really good. I have two questions. To what extent did the whole classification of domestic workers as criminals come in from colonial law? Because we see a lot of dacoit tribes that were classified by the British. And second, it's probably out of your scope. How does the gig economy disrupt classification in this field of domestic work? Has it even come to India? Because I know it has elsewhere.
Based on your discussions with, or your interviews and all of that, were there any time they shared about the topic of language and the conversations that they have with the employers or whatever? And is there also the issue of uniforms and all of that? Is there any other kind of example or the discussions that you had with them?
And I'll let you answer after this.
Okay, so the first point that you have in your conclusions about, there are many competing sort of forms of classification. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit in terms of the conceptual work that you want to do by taking on this idea of classification in your research. Like even in those two sites that you've identified, the domestic worker as criminal, the domestic worker as worker, there is a very different gaze in terms of one is a state gaze, one is maybe a union, organizing sort of a instrumentality associated with it. And there may be many, many others, right? So especially when you're talking about the subjectification of the self. And I feel like that's one of the subtexts that you are speaking about, that as you're stepping away from looking at it from an external category to who are these people and what does their everyday life look like, then just thinking about then what does this term classification, what is the work you wanted to do for you? And you've got Bourdieu there, but it's it's almost like kind of a normative sense of what it could be, rather than the instrumentality of the ways in which it is deployed. Right? So
I'll take this and I'll do one more.
Yeah, I think the question about like speciality of organizing and the nature of work, I think I think it's a central question right now, like in the scholarship, like how are domestic workers organized? What kind of challenges does it pose? But that is also different in different categories of workers. As you might know, that live-in workers, it's very difficult. So when are they organized? Like when they come for, if some of these workers are Christian by faith, every day, like Sunday when they go for Sunday mass, like that's where some of these unions go and organize them. Because you definitely can't enter, like when workers come out for lunch and sit in the common park, like that's where they are mobilized. But it's also I think today morning I was talking to an organizer in Bengaluru. It's a huge issue. It's again like when workers are organized and we talk about like resistance, bargaining power. It's very different when there are 500 workers, one employer, nobody will go inside to work, versus there are multiple employers, different issues workers are facing. So that definitely manifests in that, because you talked about speciality. It's also the my original work was on actually how women domestic workers negotiate home as workplace. So looking at this intersection of public and private, which manifest, for instance, in that at workplace, every worker in principle is entitled to some basic amenities, water, toilet, etc. Now, how that conflicts with employers' notion of privacy, and how do workers negotiate that? So I think speciality is very important, and it has direct implications for how we think of this work as a dignified work in future, and a lot of work needs to be done there. These classification entirely come from like colonial India, the question about like where do they come from. And I think what I plan to do is like carefully go through master servant related regulations, legislation discussions in colonial India, which I need to do. So I definitely think that it comes from there, while it the institution disappears from other occupations or spheres of labor. I think domestic work still remains one of the occupations where it is very much prevalent. The gig economy, again, like it's a great question. There is a Overseas Development Institute, London, recently came out with a big report, like how the gig economy, what they're calling Uberization of domestic work, can empower workers. Again, I think it's very difficult. I don't know in what ways, like Uber, like going from like being a driver at the taxi stand to like being an Uber driver, in what ways does it empower drivers? I will say the same thing. Like it's difficult. Like I think like technology can help only so much. The solutions for social problems have to come from society and like social organizing. So I'm very skeptical of that, actually, personally. I doubt in a society like ours particularly. I don't think gig apps and stuff are really going to solve the problem. Your question about like language, uniform, I think it plays out in different ways. Like employers have a notion of what is appropriate way of dressing. So both in terms of their notions of hygiene, but also sometimes culturally, like like what is, when you're coming to, when you're a domestic worker, what is an appropriate way of dressing. So of course there is a way in which working class women's sexuality is considered dangerous in middle class homes, and often employers have very strict instructions of how workers should dress. Actually, like in my master's thesis, I discussed that in detail. Language, again, it plays out different ways. Like migrant workers like struggle a lot in the beginning. You're coming from Assam, working in Delhi, coming from Bihar, working in Mumbai, definitely. But employers are increasingly, like there are sections of, so we should not think of domestic work or market for domestic work as one market. I think it's segmented, like there are like these niches. For example, people are talking about like how call center workers are leaving their jobs to become domestic workers. Yes, but they are also working for expat families. So we need to pay attention to the segmented nature of the market of domestic work. So there is a lot going on, like this requirement for skills Now, skilling is a big issue, but do all employers like will pay well if the skilling, is skilling really the issue, or it is a certain section of employers who want better skills and can afford to pay more? And I think it comes back to this whole issue of like, how do we look at this? Like, is it actually like in the West, how this, the whole prevalence of domestic work and the number of domestic workers rising is discussed as like a care crisis, what Nancy Fraser calls it. But I'm not sure if like in the global South, it's a care crisis issue. I think it's actually about the issue of surplus population. People don't have jobs. And I think it's, I feel like the care crisis, thesis really takes over. We also need to look at it that because this form of labor is so cheap, almost anybody can afford to employ like 3 workers, 2 workers. So I think like it's important to keep some of these complexities in mind. Thank you for asking that question. That what can we do with the the concept of classification to how can it be applied to what more can it tell us? Like I think right now what I'm working on is to and like particular nature of like all these occupations is going to play out. When we think of sex workers, say, we are saying that sex workers are workers. They should be recognized as workers. Before they are recognized as workers, what are the ways in which these workers like appear in the records? When we talk about street vendors, what is this notion of public space? And before one considers their claim as legitimate, like in what ways has the state? So it's also, I think, I haven't really refined this argument, and several people have already made this argument, the role of state. Is state really absent, like unorganized economy? Is state really not there? I think through this, I am trying to explore if like, if various sections of like workers in unorganized economy, maybe they haven't been given rights yet, but they have been regulated in different ways. And I think it's a question of protection of rights versus regulation. So I think classification can help us with that. That just because rights for certain groups do not exist does not mean the state has not classified them. But once again, I think it requires refining really, like in what ways, and coming up with more cases and grounding it. But currently I'm working with that hypothesis, and I think I need to think more. So thank you for asking that question.
Actually, I think my question is kind of answered by you, because I wonder what you would, what you were thinking of when you said oral histories. Oral histories of whom? The employers or the employees? And what sort of things were you asking them, and what were they speaking about? Because there's a whole lot of other stuff besides classification, as far as I can see, having worked with domestic workers all my life.
Hi, thank you for your wonderfully thoughtful presentation. I have a question about competing forms of classification, especially about how domestic workers are classified as potential criminals, and that's actually a very insidious form of classification, because the question of rights and welfare can be embedded within this classification as well. That they are compatible forms of classification, not competing exactly. And that brings me to the third conclusion, the third point in your conclusion. It reminds me of Ian Hacking's work on the looping effects of humankind, he works on mental illness, but how classification can sort of have real psychological costs, not just symbolic violence. They can have real sort of psychological costs in terms of they being sort of having, every time they have the thought that, oh, I will be accused of this crime. That's a real psychological cost, and also this extra layer of surveillance that's always present. That they're being watched, or the surveillance, the suspicion, all these are real psychological. That's it.
It's not questions really. I'm Geeta Menon from Domestic Workers' Rights Union and Street Advocacy Samiti. It's not question really, but it's a thought process. We personally feel that much of this criminalization that is adjudged to domestic workers, or this link between criminals and domestic workers, is also to do with the inherent way the caste system is structured, and the inherent way in which workers are placed in that caste hierarchy. especially domestic workers. It has to do also with the fact that till now, the whole issue of identity and dignity has not been addressed. And that identity and dignity can only be addressed if there is some recognition as worker that is adjudged to them, either by the state or even by society. Because still the values of gratitude, loyalty, and all this are so well adjudged in that whole relationship. It's still not got over. I mean, we have not still transited that relationship from that of master-slave to that of employer-employee. So that is why this criminalization aspect still continues. Again, because the privacy of the privacy of the home in which the domestic worker works, and the employer's notion of that home being my house, and anyone coming into my house is not to be trusted or has to be looked at with double this thing. So that, I think, has to do with this whole idea of criminalization. And of course, the way the state has taken it up. The way the state has taken it up to, and you know in Delhi how they put up those advertisements, wanted, they said wanted a criminal, and straight away adjudged whether you like it or not, she is a criminal. So that is one, and in the number of cases we have taken up, we have seen how it is allegation of theft and it has not been proved, yet they have made themselves to confess that they are thieves, because they have no other alternative. The second concern is, the second movement that I can see is that from 1947 onwards, or maybe it has to do with the, which has not been addressed, I think, is the whole issue of trafficking, forced labor trafficking. Initially it was not looked at as trafficking, but it was there. And when we took up the issue of child labor, child domestic labor, in the houses, they were employing 6 and 8-year-old girls. And we told them that you don't need to employ young girls. We have adult domestic workers who can work. So they said, no, it's my right to employ them. Because it's their right, because I have some land in the rural area. I keep children, families there as bonded labor and as people who work. And they still continue, therefore, to be part of my ownership. So at that time it was not considered as trafficking because it was still considered as family. Whatever family notion was there. Until today, like I was mentioning to you in the morning, that we have areas in Punjab, Mensa, we have areas in Punjab, we have in the defense quarters here, all over India, where people are still kept as family but bonded. Where there is no issue of wages at all. So that is why in the process that has been happening from 1947, the entire issue of the state then gives it a different color, where the placement agencies have to be looked at in the role of the state and in trafficking.
Thank you. You get your third question.
Yeah.
I will take the last.
The third question that I left out earlier, so not as a timetable, but it's more on sort of method. So what work is your sort of categorization from 1947 to 84, and then the years after that doing for your sort of thought process? Just can you speak more to why you've made those two time periods distinct, and also a little bit more about because they're pretty large time periods, and so I'm wondering whether you're thinking of other ways in which to kind of do a comparative analysis. If this is supposed to be comparative, then why this, and what are the other kinds of options that you're looking at?
I want to take Chair's prerogative for a comment before we enter a review for the last round. I think I'm struck by many things in your presentation, but I wanted to suggest and see if, when you think about classification and use that as a methodological entry, it may be useful to equally look for the unexpected classifications, in the sense of not looking at work at all, but looking at other classifications that make this broader link you're making, that everyday common sense, right? So I was very struck by the fact that you're struck by the fact that when you ask workers, what do you think about, they say theft. They all say theft. They don't say violence. Even though what's interesting about the relation between domestic work and sex work, in the first and largest non-governmental census of sex workers we have now by sex workers unions, 40% of current self-identified sex workers used to be domestic workers and left domestic work to do sex work in order to get greater control over their bodies. It's a very striking kind of labor shift, right, which talks very much about the space of domestic work also as a space of extreme sexualized violence, right, and surveillance, not just by the state, but in that space. So I'm struck then on saying, what other kinds of classifications do this kind of work of meaning making? So when you talk about domestic work as work that is meant to disappear, this is exactly the debate, for example, on the slum. You can't reform the slum because the slum should not exist. So Nehru talked about eradicating the slum for the people who lived in the slum. Right? When you talk about slum-free cities, it's very unclear even in contemporary whether you mean that there should be no slums or should be no poor people. Because the conditions to live in formal housing don't exist, but you don't want the slum. But the category of slum plays the same role of meaning making, because you constantly classify it. I also think in some ways of classification in the work of the new transgender legislation. Right? And the question of a very different entry into law, which is how should we include you? But even how should we include you, not even how should we criminalize you under CRPC, how should we include you needs to say that who will decide who will be the claimant. The same debate on reservation in some ways. So I'm interested actually in saying what are, as both a suggestion to you and also a sort of thought experiment, what are kind of classifications that have nothing to do with work, but do the same work of meaning making? Right? When you think about bodies and spaces, even the classification of the National Green Tribunal of what counts as a water reservoir is actually a very different way in which you impart meaning through the act of classification. And I feel like in some ways it could be very interesting to juxtapose completely dissimilar modes of classification that do the same political work of misrecognition and see what those cross readings can give you. Because I think in one way it's an intuitive comparison to do street vendor versus domestic worker, construction work versus domestic work, and stay within informal work. But what if you took that frame out? What would then you compare the classification of domestic work to that was not a classification of work? It's just a thought experiment. I think that would be very useful because I think it will allow you to take Sudeshta's point to be much more agile with classification and not see it only in the way it played out for domestic work, especially looking at a historical archive in many kinds of ways. So that's my last. Last round to you, and then we'll close.
Okay, no questions. Thank you for asking that question about oral histories, because I didn't discuss them, so I didn't get into the details. The reason I included oral histories in my field work is because there's only so much newspaper data and all these things can tell you. What I was interested in is people who organize workers. So I was mostly interested in speaking to people who organize workers. Okay. My second, I have mostly worked with workers. Like I've interviewed domestic workers before, but this phase of field work for this research project in particular, I wanted to find people who either have seen some sort of organizing going on. So if there is a figure in Delhi who was active in trade union movement in the 70s and 80s, or Bombay, if they can tell me something about what was going on, how did they look at industrial workers and domestic workers, to just basically to help me produce an account of that time. So I was mostly looking at organizers, but in the process of fieldwork, I realized that it's important for me to try finding workers who worked in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They also have a way of narrating. How did they look at it? And by the time I realized it, it was late. It's just mostly this summer that I collected this material. So, but thank you for asking that question. And it's just situating these struggles in historical context, social, Bombay and Delhi, what was going on. You can't take these struggles out. And I missed responding to that question about the plantation economy in Kerala and how did what that that context has to say about the unionization. I think the kind of material I have right now, which is mostly newspaper and labor archives, they provide this preliminary information that something existed, what workers were saying, and I think I need to then go deeper in these archives to situate them. So at the moment, my material doesn't allow, and I don't have an answer, but this is something I'm definitely going to think about. Your questions were great. I will just respond to one. There were a few which I understood fully. Is that the real cost of classification? I'm not saying that this is something which is like there is a discourse and there is no real cost. Definitely there is a real cost. For example, a non-recognition of domestic workers as workers, like those who have been organizing workers for last 2 decades. Ask them that when you go to labor commissioner to get a union registered, they're like, no, we will not register. Now, is it everywhere? No, because there are parts of the country where, it's a non-issue. Like, domestic workers organizations have gone and they're like, okay, we want to be registered, and they have registered. So, one point I will also make is that, state is not, like, I didn't discuss it, but it's not static, it's not a thing, like, Maharashtra, labor struggles relationship is very different with the state than, when I look at Delhi. But like in this, like here I'm not problematizing that. So it's just like, there are definitely real causes of like how workers are classified, like affecting their material conditions and prospects. I think Geeta ji already has made some like fantastic points about the organization. I will say that, criminalization or labor in general, we can't understand without caste. So can we say that master-servant relationship in India historically have been without caste? No, because a lot of agricultural workers, landless, they were Dalits. So I'm saying that, there is a history from where these things come, like, the Criminal Tribes Act, and the symbolic and real violence it has inflicted on certain caste groups in India, So when I was going through these archives, it's also looking at like, the caste, like criminalized, and then how they repeatedly appear in these records. The time period question, Rahul, you asked is, I think is useful. I will say at the moment, it's, it describes, I mean, it's mostly the purpose of dividing the time period I'm looking at in 2 phases is descriptive, but first also to establish that the first one was important enough for us to have 2 periods. Like, so for example, based on like some strikes, agitations, can we say that there was a movement of domestic workers, or it's just like some scattered struggles? So at the moment, I will not make that claim, but what I need to do is like go through newspaper data in detail, come up with like some nice graphs of like showing like, okay, this strike here, that strike there, over decades. And I think, how that will help us? I will say that that has a lot to say in terms of, it's not just domestic work. I will say that it will allow us to understand, labor's relationship with, informal labor's relationship with labor in general, like organized labor. Like one of the hypotheses I have, for example, is that, why Delhi and Bombay look different. One is obvious, but is that in Bombay, where the history of like labor militancy is there, compared to Delhi. So, it's, and I think that that will challenge some of the narratives which have looked at like organized labor, which has only excluded marginalized sections of labor. We also need to look at, if I may use the word, like externalities, that, when there is an organized working class, that has positive effects for working class in general. I think that's a brilliant comment and question. Unexpected, classification, and the example you gave of like, women leaving domestic work, and that, from my own field work, I'm thinking about it, and what could be possible ways. And I think it's something very fundamental changes if I take informal labor out, because I've thought about like sex workers, street vendors, and others. And I think as I'm analyzing these findings, I think I'm going to grapple more with that and then have something. But I'm thinking as you asked that question. So thank you.
But also because Brodeu's work on misrecognition came from the context of race.
Mm-hmm.
And it plays a very specific historical role in thinking about misrecognition and race. And so when you move misrecognition out of that context of race in secular France, in the mid-20th, then I think some work has to be done to be able to fix that. As a concept. And I think you're doing it. And the thing that I'm just pushing you to think a little bit more about what the frictions are.
Right. No, I think absolutely. I think the only struggle with Bourdieu is that it's very difficult to make sense of Bourdieu as a whole. So the article yeah. So one article I'm drawing on, which is I think like his key piece of writing on classification, It's an article where he uses words like classes on paper. It's a critique of a Marxian understanding of class. And where he's talking about that, like you need to look at like the social space, there are different forms of capital, and mostly, I think it's, he uses symbolic violence also in context of like Algeria, like, decolonization and what's happening like as Algeria is being decolonized. But I think it'll be useful for me to put together, Bourdieu's discussion of classification in different contexts and how I can use that. So thank you. Yeah.
All right, please join me in thanking for this very, very and to also again I've always thanked Vikas and Tanvi to manage our public series and bring you these lectures. Please stay tuned. If you're not on the mailing list, you can sign up. Let any of us know, me or Tanvi or Vikas, and we do also encourage you to follow up with the other. The building, which means the lectures will get more regular. Tomorrow we have a film screening, which is, I'm going to get a drum. Yeah, sure. Can you, 6:30 p.m. and you want to say 2 lines about it? Alright, fine. So we will set it up. There's a really good film. It is about women's organized resistance in the Northeast, specifically in Nagaland and Manipur, and it's a really fantastic film. I encourage you to come back and see it. And again, our copies of Sonal's latest piece in the Hindu about women's workspace. Feel free to pick one up. Thank you very much for coming and have an excellent